Picture this. In the past 48 hours, the entire political establishment has been blindsided. Immigration judges terminated without warning. State governments confronted with ultimatums they never saw coming. Welfare fraud worth billions suddenly exposed to federal scrutiny. And standing at the center of it all, a president executing moves so bold that even his own party didn't see them coming. Moves that opponents are labeling as authoritarian overreach, but supporters call the first real attempt to fix a broken system in generations. But here's what makes this different. These aren't random policy changes, they're connected, they're deliberate, and they're targeting the exact pressure points that control how federal power actually works: the judiciary, the bureaucracy, the funding mechanisms, and the enforcement apparatus itself. Today, we're going to expose exactly what's happening behind the headlines, how these seemingly separate actions form a single master strategy, and why Washington insiders are calling this the most calculated power consolidation in modern American history. By the time we're done, you'll see why this goes far beyond politics, far beyond Trump, and why it represents a fundamental rewiring of government itself. Before we get into the shocking revelations, the terminations, the confrontations, the threats, there's something fundamental you need to grasp. None of what's unfolding happens spontaneously. For years, tens of millions of Americans have witnessed our immigration apparatus grind to a halt. Cases piled up like forgotten paperwork in a basement. Social programs bled taxpayer money to individuals who had no legal right to receive it. And our borders, well, they functioned more like voluntary checkpoints than actual lines of sovereignty. Let me put it this way. Picture yourself owning a home and you spot water stains spreading across your ceiling. Initially, it's just a minor discoloration. You dismiss it, then it expands. You apply some paint. But the real issue isn't the surface damage. It's the plumbing buried inside your walls. At some point, you face a choice: keep applying temporary fixes or tear out the broken infrastructure and rebuild it properly. That's precisely where America arrived. The apparatus wasn't merely malfunctioning anymore. It had collapsed at its structural core. For generations, immigration tribunals operated at an impossibly slow pace. Individuals would cross illegally, receive a hearing date, and that appointment could be 3, 5, sometimes 10 years into the future. Throughout that waiting period, they'd find employment, start families, build entire lives, all while theoretically awaiting a proceeding that frequently never materialized. The case accumulation became so staggering that hearings being scheduled right now won't occur until well into the 2030s. Let that reality settle in. We're discussing a framework where delayed justice isn't simply denied, it's completely abandoned. And this wasn't merely bureaucratic incompetence. For certain administrators, this paralysis served a purpose. Why? Because an apparatus that never reaches decisions is an apparatus that never removes anyone. It evolved into an unofficial pathway to permanent status through administrative attrition. Meanwhile, American taxpayers bore the burden, not just economically, but demographically, culturally, and from a security standpoint. Trump's team didn't accidentally stumble into these recent maneuvers. They've been systematically compiling evidence, submitting information requests, constructing legal frameworks, and preparing for a comprehensive transformation. This wasn't spontaneous, this was methodical. And that leads us to the first earthquake nobody in Washington anticipated. Within a matter of weeks, more than 100 immigration adjudicators were dismissed, not transferred, not disciplined, terminated outright. In New York City by itself, over a dozen adjudicators got termination letters. In San Francisco, the figure was substantially higher. Entire judicial facilities watched a quarter or more of their personnel removed in one coordinated action. This wasn't modest restructuring. This was a complete organizational purge. Now, you're probably wondering, does a president actually possess that authority? Aren't adjudicators meant to be independent? Well, here's the critical distinction. We're not discussing federal judges, the type confirmed for lifetime appointments under Article 3 of the Constitution. Those judges are protected from political interference by constitutional design, but immigration adjudicators, they operate differently. They serve under the Executive Office for Immigration Review, which exists within the Department of Justice's jurisdiction, and the Department of Justice answers directly to the chief executive. So yes, constitutionally, the president possesses the power to remove these personnel. They're components of the executive apparatus, not the judicial system. But constitutional authority and historical precedent represent two separate concepts. Never in American history has a president terminated immigration adjudicators at this magnitude or velocity. The action created shockwaves throughout the legal establishment, and the backlash was instantaneous. Progressive organizations labeled it tyrannical. Constitutional experts questioned its legality. Media organizations published reports describing it as a slaughter. But here's the information they consistently omitted from their coverage: why these particular adjudicators became targets to begin with. An examination, and not from some politically motivated publication, but from a relatively objective source, revealed that numerous terminated adjudicators maintained extraordinarily elevated asylum approval percentages. We're discussing adjudicators who granted asylum at rates dramatically exceeding the national median, sometimes providing relief in situations where the legal threshold obviously wasn't satisfied. One adjudicator in Manhattan, for example, approved asylum more frequently than any other adjudicator in that entire facility. Another maintained a case accumulation so severe that matters on their calendar were being scheduled into the latter portion of the 2030s. Now let's maintain perspective. Not every adjudicator faced removal for excessive leniency. Some simply couldn't manage their workload volume. Others faced procedural violations or ethical allegations. But the pattern emerged unmistakably. Adjudicators who approached immigration proceedings as platforms for activism rather than enforcement became the primary targets. And when you're confronting an accumulation approaching 4 million pending cases, yes, you're hearing that correctly, nearly 4 million, efficiency and uniformity become critical factors. Delayed justice equals denied justice, as the principle states. And for American taxpayers watching their contributions finance this perpetual cycle of proceedings and appeals, their exasperation had reached a critical threshold. So the administration took action. They didn't request approval. They didn't establish a commission to analyze the problem for 24 months. They identified the dysfunction, utilized their constitutional powers, and executed the dismissals. Was it aggressive? Absolutely. Was it constitutional? According to legal framework, yes. Was it essential? That determination depends on whether you believe an apparatus disintegrating under its own dysfunction requires fundamental reconstruction or merely another superficial remedy. But terminating adjudicators represented only the opening move. The second phase genuinely sent tremors through the entire legal infrastructure. Here's where the situation becomes even more compelling. The administration didn't simply dismiss adjudicators. They began recruiting replacements, and they're designating them with different terminology. Not immigration adjudicators, removal adjudicators. Now that might appear to be linguistic manipulation, but terminology carries significance. And in this situation, the designation telegraphs a fundamental transformation in operational mandate. The Department of Homeland Security just published employment opportunities for these roles, advertising compensation exceeding $200,000 annually with remote work possibilities. Superficially, it appears to be an attractive federal position, but examine more carefully the credentials they're requiring. Experience in immigration enforcement, military backgrounds, federal law enforcement service, conspicuously missing, experience in immigration defense work, or advocacy activities. A prominent publication analyzed the professional histories of approximately a dozen recently appointed adjudicators and discovered that not a single individual had previously worked representing immigrants in legal proceedings, not one. Every single appointment originated from enforcement backgrounds, IC, Border Patrol, military legal offices, or federal prosecution divisions. If you were constructing a judicial framework designed to process matters efficiently and emphasize removals, this represents exactly the methodology you'd employ. Now, progressive activists and immigrant advocacy organizations are raising urgent warnings. They contend that a judiciary composed entirely of former enforcement officials cannot maintain impartiality. They express concern that proceedings will transform into automatic approvals for removal rather than legitimate evaluations of asylum petitions. And they're not mistaken to worry. Bias operates in multiple directions. An adjudicator who dedicated 20 years as an ICE prosecutor will likely evaluate cases through a vastly different perspective than someone who dedicated 20 years assisting asylum applicants. But here's the alternative perspective, and it's one that connects with substantial numbers of Americans, particularly those who've observed the apparatus fail for generations. The previous methodology wasn't functioning. When your immigration tribunals maintain an accumulation calculated in millions, when cases require years to adjudicate, when adjudicators approve asylum petitions that subsequently prove fraudulent, transformation becomes imperative. You cannot continue identical practices and anticipate different outcomes. That's not jurisprudence. That's institutional dysfunction. So the administration made a strategic decision. They're emphasizing efficiency and enforcement over extended deliberation. They're recruiting adjudicators who comprehend the law from the viewpoint of securing borders, not from the viewpoint of discovering technical mechanisms to permit extended stays. Is that equitable? Is that constitutional? Those represent complex questions. Some will respond affirmatively, others negatively. But one reality remains indisputable. The framework is undergoing fundamental transformation, and it's occurring more rapidly than anyone projected. And this wasn't exclusively about adjudicators and tribunals. The subsequent maneuver targeted the financial infrastructure, the essential resource of political influence. Let's discuss SNAP. That's the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, previously designated as food stamps. It represents one of the most extensive federal assistance programs in the nation, providing benefits to over 40 million Americans. It's also, according to recent examinations, saturated with fraudulent activity. Here's what transpired. The administration, through the Department of Agriculture, demanded comprehensive records from all 50 states regarding SNAP benefit recipients. Not simply statistical summaries, they demanded names, residential addresses, social security identifiers, benefit quantities, and immigration classifications. Why? Because they suspected widespread fraud, individuals receiving benefits across multiple states, deceased persons still receiving payments, non-citizens unlawfully enrolled in the system. Now, you'd reasonably expect that if states are managing a federal program with federal funding, they'd readily provide that information, correct? Well, here's where complications emerge. Approximately half the states cooperated, predominantly red states, but over 20 states, virtually all of them blue, declined. California, New York, Minnesota, and others essentially informed the federal government, no, that information isn't available to you. Their justification, privacy protections. They maintained that the administration's demand was unprecedented, intrusive, and extended far beyond standard accountability. They feared the information would be utilized not to combat fraud, but to intimidate immigrant populations and generate apprehension. Advocacy organizations reinforced these objections, characterizing it as a barely concealed intimidation campaign, but the administration maintained their position. Instead, they delivered an ultimatum: provide the information or we'll suspend your SNAP funding. No cooperation, no financial support. It represented an aggressive strategy, and it immediately generated legal challenges. Democratic state executives accused the administration of politicizing assistance programs. Constitutional experts questioned whether the federal government possessed authority to suspend mandatory appropriations. Judicial bodies issued contradictory determinations. Some ruled the suspension constitutional, others ruled it wasn't. And here's where the situation becomes genuinely fascinating. Observing all this develop, this isn't genuinely about SNAP. It's about authority. It's about whether the federal government can mandate accountability in programs it finances. If states can simply decline to provide information, then federal accountability becomes irrelevant. You're essentially operating a $1 trillion framework on unverified trust. Now, consider your personal experience for a moment. If you've ever submitted applications for Social Security, Medicare, or any governmental benefit, you understand they demand everything: your employment records, your financial documentation, your medical history. They authenticate it comprehensively. Why? Because they must confirm you're qualified and that taxpayer resources are being allocated appropriately. That's fundamental logic. So why should SNAP operate under different standards? The administration's position is straightforward. If taxpayer resources are being distributed, the government possesses both authority and obligation to track their allocation. If someone is exploiting the system, collecting benefits across 3 states using different identities, that's fraud. If deceased individuals remain on distribution lists, that's wasteful spending. If non-citizens who lack legal eligibility are receiving benefits, that's systematic abuse. And if states won't assist in identifying these problems, then perhaps they shouldn't be managing the program at all. Critics respond that the genuine objective isn't combating fraud, it's generating a suppression effect. Make immigrants fearful to request benefits even when they're legally authorized. Utilize information demands as an indirect mechanism for immigration enforcement. Transform assistance offices into ICE intelligence operations. But here's the complication. Fraud exists as an undeniable reality. The magnitude might be contested, but the existence cannot be. And when the federal government requests fundamental accountability protocols and states refuse compliance, it generates an unavoidable question. What are they concealing? And that question becomes increasingly significant when you examine what's been discovered in locations like Minnesota, where the fraud wasn't merely hypothetical, it was astronomical. Minnesota transformed into the epicenter for one of the most devastating fraud revelations in contemporary history. We're discussing a billion-dollar catastrophe that remained unaddressed for years, and it concentrated substantially around entities within the Somali immigrant population. Now, before anyone levels accusations of prejudice or discrimination, let me be absolutely transparent. This isn't about ethnic background or religious affiliation. I'm simply reporting documented facts, and this concerns accountability. When fraud occurs, it must be exposed regardless of who's perpetrating it. Here's what investigators documented. Multiple organizations in Minnesota, numerous ones operated by or providing services to Somali immigrants, were systematically exploiting federal programs. We're discussing childcare fraud, where fictitious facilities requested reimbursements for non-existent children. We're discussing SNAP fraud, where benefits were converted to cash at reduced values. We're discussing housing assistance fraud, tax fraud, identity fraud. The catalog continues extensively, and the magnitude estimates span from hundreds of millions to exceeding $1 billion. Now, when this became public knowledge, the response was immediate and polarized. President Trump conducted a press conference where he spoke without diplomatic restraint. He condemned Minnesota's political leadership for permitting this to occur. He specifically referenced Representative Ilhan Omar, implying that she and her political allies had deliberately ignored the problem because numerous perpetrators belonged to their voter constituency. He even declared that she shouldn't be permitted to serve in Congress and should be expelled from the country. That rhetoric generated intense backlash. Community representatives in Minneapolis drew comparisons between the targeting of Somali populations in 1930s Germany. They contended that requiring individuals to carry documentation verifying citizenship recalled authoritarian regimes. They accused the administration of xenophobia, of scapegoating vulnerable immigrant populations, of exploiting isolated fraud instances to rationalize extensive crackdowns on entire communities. And listen, those concerns aren't without historical foundation. History contains countless examples where governments exploit genuine problems as justifications for discrimination. So we must remain vigilant. We must ensure that combating fraud doesn't become a pretext for targeting individuals based on their heritage. But here's the alternative perspective. When state administrators were alerted about this fraud years previously, and they definitely were, according to extensive documentation, they accomplished essentially nothing. Hundreds of state personnel identified suspicious patterns, internal whistleblowers came forward with evidence, official audits exposed systematic irregularities, and yet the political determination to investigate and prosecute simply didn't materialize. Why? Because it was politically disadvantageous, because it might estrange a voting demographic, because exposing fraud within immigrant populations, even when it's thoroughly documented, exposes you to accusations of discrimination. So the fraudulent activity persisted unchecked. The overwhelming majority who comply with regulations, contribute through employment, and enrich their communities became associated with criminal activity. That represents the genuine tragedy here. When an apparatus tolerates fraud because prosecuting it is politically uncomfortable, everyone suffers consequences, taxpayers suffer, legitimate benefit recipients suffer, and the credibility of the programs themselves deteriorates. Trump's language was confrontational, but the fundamental argument was difficult to refute. Accountability matters fundamentally. If we permit certain populations to be excluded from scrutiny because we're apprehensive about criticism, we're not demonstrating compassion, we're demonstrating irresponsibility, and that irresponsibility generates consequences measured in billions of dollars. But here's the critical point. This wasn't isolated to Minnesota. As investigators began examining the evidence, they discovered fraudulent activity everywhere Washington investigated. Let's expand the perspective momentarily and examine the comprehensive picture. SNAP fraud in blue states, Somali-linked fraud in Minnesota, but that's merely the beginning. Investigators uncovered extensive exploitation in the Small Business Administration, particularly in pandemic assistance programs. Remember those paycheck protection loans? Billions of dollars transferred to non-existent businesses, to applicants who misrepresented their workforce numbers, to individuals who spent the resources on luxury vehicles and vacations instead of employee compensation. Then there's Social Security. Individuals collecting benefits while residing internationally, sometimes in nations we don't maintain diplomatic relationships with. Deceased persons whose relatives continued receiving payments for years. Disability determinations approved based on fabricated medical documentation. And immigration, while that represents an entirely different magnitude. Individuals entering the country under fraudulent circumstances, requesting asylum based on manufactured narratives, vanishing into the interior before their scheduled hearings. Multiple identities, multiple benefit requests, multiple states, all simultaneously. Now, here's what connects all of this together. It's not that fraud represents a new phenomenon. Fraud has perpetually existed, but what's transformed now is the scale, and more critically, the absence of verification infrastructure to detect it. Our governmental databases don't communicate with each other. An individual can request benefits in California, receive approval, then submit another request in New York using a marginally altered identity, and the systems won't generate alerts. We've constructed a bureaucratic apparatus so expansive and so fragmented that it's practically engineered to be exploited. Consider it through this lens. Imagine you operate a financial institution and you don't verify whether loan applicants actually exist. You don't authenticate their income. You don't cross-reference their submissions. You simply distribute money based on what they document on a form. How long would that financial institution remain operational? Approximately 5 minutes, correct? Yet, that's fundamentally how we've been at programs for generations. Feeling part, it's not completely accidental. For certain politicians, a bloated, dysfunctional apparatus represents an advantage, not a liability. Because the more individuals who depend on governmental assistance, even inappropriately, the more voters you maintain with investment in preserving the apparatus exactly as it exists. It's a mechanism of political protection. You're not simply purchasing votes with taxpayer resources, you're purchasing future electoral support by ensuring the apparatus remains too dysfunctional to reform. That might sound pessimistic, but observe the opposition to reform initiatives. Every time someone proposes strengthening eligibility standards, the response is immediate and aggressive. You're attempting to harm children. You're attacking vulnerable populations. You're demonstrating cruelty and heartlessness. Never mind that the requirements are intended to ensure that exclusively eligible individuals receive benefits. Never mind that every dollar distributed fraudulently is a dollar unavailable for someone who legitimately needs assistance. Which leads us to one of the most contentious maneuvers yet. While all of this was developing, the adjudicator terminations, the SNAP information confrontations, the fraud investigations, Trump began discussing something even more significant: restructuring executive authority itself. He began publicly advocating for the elimination of the Senate filibuster. He proposed that immigration adjudicators should possess even less autonomy, that removal determinations should be expedited to the point of being virtually automatic. He contended that the executive branch requires expanded authority, not reduced authority, because Congress has demonstrated itself incapable of action. Now, this is where even certain Trump supporters begin experiencing discomfort. The filibuster, despite its limitations, represents a mechanism that compels compromise. It prevents the majority party from implementing whatever agenda it desires without at least some bipartisan consensus. Eliminating it might benefit Republicans presently, but what about subsequently when Democrats regain control? Do we genuinely want to provide them that same unrestricted authority? Trump's reasoning is uncomplicated. Democrats have already demonstrated they'll eliminate the filibuster the instant it's advantageous. Prominent Democratic senators publicly advocated it during the previous administration. They wanted to expand the Supreme Court, eliminate the filibuster, grant statehood to DC and Puerto Rico, all to establish permanent political dominance. So why should Republicans adhere to rules the opposition has no intention of respecting? It's a compelling argument, especially to individuals who feel they've been losing the cultural struggle for generations while attempting to maintain principles. But it's also hazardous because once you begin dismantling institutional protections, you cannot restore them. The forces cannot be contained once released. Treasury administrators and key counselors have contributed opinions, many endorsing the maneuver. They contend that America confronts a crisis, a border crisis, a fiscal crisis, a cultural crisis, and that crises demand decisive action, not perpetual discussion. They reference the accumulation in immigration tribunals, the paralysis in Congress, the refusal of states to comply with federal statutes. How do you repair a dysfunctional apparatus if the apparatus itself prevents you from repairing it? Others, including certain constitutional scholars who lean conservative, caution that this trajectory leads to authoritarianism. Not because Trump is a tyrant, but because the precedents being established will survive any individual president. You might trust Trump with expanded executive authority, but do you trust the subsequent president and the one following that? These represent difficult questions, and there aren't simple answers. What's evident is that Trump is expanding the parameters of executive authority in ways we haven't observed in contemporary American politics. And he's executing it systematically across numerous domains, which brings us to his most startling maneuver yet. In a press conference that surprised even his own staff members, Trump confirmed that the administration is evaluating airstrikes on Venezuelan territory, not simply intercepting narcotic vessels at sea, which has been occurring for months, but actual strikes within Venezuelan borders, targeting cartel infrastructure, production facilities, and trafficking routes. The legal rationale, Article 2 of the Constitution, which designates the president as commander-in-chief and provides him authority to address imminent threats. Here's where historical context provides some perspective. American presidents have authorized airstrikes and limited military operations without congressional authorization numerous times. Barack Obama executed it in Libya and Syria and Yemen. Trump himself executed it during his initial term against Iranian installations. George W. Bush executed it repeatedly following September 11th, so the precedent for executive military action is thoroughly established. But terrestrial strikes within a sovereign nation, even a deteriorating narco state like Venezuela, elevate it to another dimension. And the optics are problematic. It's one situation to intercept vessels in international waters. It's quite another to bomb installations within another nation's territorial boundaries. That's the type of action that can escalate rapidly, involving regional powers and generating diplomatic catastrophes. Trump's advocates contend that Venezuela under Maduro barely qualifies as a functioning state, that it's essentially a cartel with governmental trappings, and that treating it with diplomatic courtesy while it devastates Americans is absurd. His critics contend that unilateral military action without congressional discussion or international coalition formation establishes a hazardous precedent. But while foreign policy dominated headlines, something else was occurring inside federal agencies that might generate even more enduring consequences. Remember Jack Smith, the special counsel who dedicated over a year investigating Trump on charges connected to January 6th and classified documents. Well, Congress just issued him a subpoena. They want him to testify under oath regarding how he was appointed, who authorized his investigation, and whether the entire special counsel operation was constitutional from the beginning. Here's why that carries significance. There's an expanding legal argument endorsed by certain prominent judges and constitutional scholars that special counsels like Jack Smith aren't actually constitutional. The theory operates like this. The Constitution permits Congress to establish federal offices, and it permits the president to appoint officials to occupy those positions with Senate confirmation. But special counsels are appointed by the Attorney General, not the president, and they aren't confirmed by anyone. They're essentially unaccountable officials with tremendous power and zero oversight. A federal judge in Florida actually dismissed one of Smith's cases on precisely these grounds, determining that his appointment was unconstitutional. The determination was contentious and likely to face appeal, but it created an opening, and now Congress wants to proceed through it. If they can demonstrate that Smith's appointment was invalid from inception, then everything he accomplished, every subpoena, every indictment, every interrogation becomes constitutionally tainted, legally irrelevant. More than that, it would challenge the entire special counsel framework, which has been utilized repeatedly over recent decades to investigate presidents from both political parties. Now, why does this integrate into the broader narrative we've been constructing today? Because it's entirely about control. Control over who investigates whom. Control over whether political adversaries can weaponize the justice apparatus. Control over the mechanisms of accountability. Jack Smith, whatever you think of his professional integrity, was component of a framework that permits unelected officials to exercise immense power with minimal oversight. Trump's team is systematically deconstructing that framework, component by component. And that brings us to the most critical insight of all, the one that synthesizes everything together. If you've been following the progression, you might be thinking, this is overwhelming. Adjudicators, welfare fraud, information confrontations, military strikes, special counsels. How does it all interconnect? Well, here's the connecting thread. Trump's strategy operates on three foundational pillars: tribunals, information, and enforcement. Tribunals determine who remains and who's removed. If immigration adjudicators are inefficient, lenient, or ideologically resistant to removal, the apparatus becomes obstructed. But if you replace them with adjudicators who emphasize efficiency and enforcement, cases progress more rapidly, removals increase, the accumulation diminishes. Information exposes fraud. If states refuse to surrender records, fraud remains concealed. But if you compel compliance, you can cross-reference databases, identify exploitation, recognize non-citizens unlawfully enrolled in programs, and eliminate waste. Information represents power. Enforcement implements the law. It's irrelevant how effective your adjudicators are or how accurate your information is if you lack the determination to enforce consequences. That signifies ICE operations, that signifies prosecution, that signifies suspending resources from non-compliant states. And yes, that might even signify military action against foreign cartels. Trump's maneuvers over recent weeks have targeted all three pillars simultaneously. He terminated adjudicators and recruited enforcers. He demanded information and penalized states that declined. He intensified removals, fraud prosecutions, and even military operations. It's not disorder, it's coordination. And that's why this moment carries such significance. We're not simply discussing policy modifications or executive directives that the subsequent administration will reverse. We're discussing structural transformations to how the federal government functions, transformations that will define immigration policy, welfare administration, and executive authority for generations. Will it succeed? That depends on how you define success. If the objective is accelerated removals, reduced fraud, and a more powerful executive branch, then probably affirmative. If the objective is maintaining institutional checks, protecting vulnerable populations, and preserving diplomatic conventions, then probably negative. Most likely, the reality will settle somewhere between extremes. Tribunals will operate more efficiently, but certain new adjudicators will prove equally fallible as their predecessors. Fraud will decrease, but aggressive information collection will generate new privacy concerns and discourage legitimate benefit utilization. Enforcement will intensify, but it will also generate narratives of families separated and lives disrupted. The question isn't whether change is occurring. The question is whether this change represents repair or demolition. He dismissed adjudicators and recruited enforcement specialists. He demanded comprehensive information and penalized states that resisted. He accelerated removals, fraud investigations, and even foreign military operations. It's not disorganization, it's strategic coordination. And that's precisely why this moment carries such profound significance. We're not simply discussing temporary policy adjustments or executive directives that the following administration will overturn. We're discussing fundamental alterations to how the federal apparatus functions. Alterations that will shape immigration policy, welfare administration, and executive authority for generations to come. Will it prove effective? That determination depends entirely on how you measure effectiveness. If the objective is expedited removals, diminished fraud, and a more authoritative executive branch, then likely affirmative. If the objective is preserving institutional safeguards, protecting vulnerable communities, and maintaining diplomatic standards, then likely negative. Most probably, reality will settle somewhere between these extremes. Tribunals will function more rapidly, but certain newly appointed adjudicators will demonstrate equivalent flaws as their predecessors. Fraudulent activity will decline, but aggressive information gathering will spawn fresh privacy anxieties and discourage legitimate benefit applications. Enforcement will strengthen, but it will simultaneously produce narratives of separated families and disrupted existences. So what conclusion can we draw from all of this? Within merely several weeks, Trump Trump terminated over 100 immigration adjudicators and substituted them with enforcement-oriented replacements. He coerced more than 20 states to surrender detailed welfare information, threatening to suspend financial support if they declined. He exposed massive fraudulent operations and programs spanning from SNAP to Social Security, with specific emphasis on immigrant populations in Minnesota. He advocated for eliminating the Senate filibuster to force through reforms that Congress refuses to advance. He authorized military operations within foreign territory without congressional permission, and he initiated an examination into whether the special counsel who investigated him possessed legitimate constitutional appointment from the outset. Whether you endorse every decision or not, one reality remains unquestionable. This represents the most extensive, most coordinated transformation of executive authority we've witnessed in contemporary American governance. It impacts everything: the judicial system, the borders, welfare infrastructure, foreign policy, and federal accountability mechanisms. And it's unfolding at a velocity that leaves even experienced political analysts struggling to comprehend. For Americans who recall an era when government operated gradually, when transformations required years of discussion and negotiation, this might seem destabilizing, but for millions of Americans who've observed the apparatus fail for generations, who've witnessed borders disregarded, fraud permitted, and accountability evaporated, this represents something fundamentally different. It represents a day of reckoning. And here's the ultimate reality. Whether this restructuring fortifies America or destabilizes it fundamentally won't become evident for years, perhaps generations. We're experiencing history in real time, and history doesn't arrive with obvious interpretations. It's chaotic, complex, and saturated with unforeseen consequences. What we can accomplish is remain educated, pose challenging questions, demand accountability from all participants, and recognize that in a constitutional republic, authority is only as legitimate as the consent of the governed. That's us. That's you. If you want to remain informed about these historic power transformations and comprehend what these executive actions genuinely signify for American families, make certain you like this video, subscribe, and leave a comment expressing whether you believe these changes will fortify the apparatus or destabilize Washington fundamentally. Your perspective matters now more than ever, because ultimately this transcends Trump. It concerns the type of nation we're constructing for our children and grandchildren. A nation where statutes are enforced equitably, where fraud faces consequences, where borders possess significance, or a nation where executive authority operates without restraint, where accountability is demolished, and where the pendulum oscillates so dramatically in one direction that the inevitable correction becomes catastrophic. Only time will provide certainty, but one reality is absolute.